I'm Jasjot, and for the past few months, I have been fascinated with the phenomena that is learning. I mean, how are we going from not knowing something to understanding it so well that we can achieve incredible feats with it? What is learning? What is happening in our brains when we learn something? How does it work and how to learn better? And what is the point of it anyway? This video is kind of an overview of what I learned while hunting for the answers to these questions. And despite it being considerably long, it does not quite cover all the aspects that I originally intended to share. Still, it packs a lot of information to digest, and if you're intrigued by these questions just like I was, then I think you'll find this video definitely worth your while. So, without further ado, let's begin uncovering the science of learning. Learning. We can define it as acquiring knowledge and skills to tackle problems and make sense of future opportunities. Now, implicit in that definition are a few key aspects that we need to understand. First, learning and memory are necessarily closely linked. For learning to be useful, there need to be some kind of storage or representation of the information such that the newly acquired knowledge or skill can be utilized later when we need it. Secondly, your brain physically changes whenever you learn anything new. From neuroscience, we know that memories are encoded by physical changes in the brain. Our everyday experiences, tasks, problems, and solutions, they strengthen these pathways, forming habits, reinforcing memories, and improving skills whenever we practice or train. The brain consists of neurons. These are cells that are capable of sending or receiving electrical signals to one another. Each neuron can be connected to from a few hundreds of other neurons to thousands of other neurons. Throughout our lives, the experiences that we have changes how these neurons can be wired to one another. And so, learning changes and mold our brains. Now, learning can be deliberate, like when we practice or train, but it can also be automatic. For example, habit formation from our everyday experiences and behaviors. And we need to keep learning and remember all of our lives, be that our schools, jobs, academia, learning to flirt, learning to handle difficult colleagues, raising kids, and so on. Learning is an evergreen process. It is kind of a meta skill, if you will. It is the skill of acquiring skills. And if you're good at it, there's a decent chance that you will have an advantage in life. Now, there are many more aspects of learning to discuss: effective strategies, learning being deeper and more durable when it's effortful, us being poor judges of whether we are learning well or not, the importance of mistakes, and much more. All of this we will be delving into, but first, we need to look at how it happens, what goes on in our brains when we are learning something. To say it shortly, neuroplasticity happens. The connections between neurons that I mentioned before are called synapses. These synapses get more robust or stronger the more we do something and the better we get. That is, the brain is not fixed. We change it with what we do. Learning is essentially creation, refinement, and strengthening of these synapses, these connections, these links in the long term memory. To understand what's going on a bit better when we are learning something, let's take a step back and look at neurons. These neurons are the building blocks of our brain. Each of us has about 86 billion of these. The key characteristic that we need to keep in mind about neurons is that they are electrically excitable cells. They can generate electric signals that can propagate to other neurons, forming a basis of communication between cells. Let's illustrate a neuron using a dot. This is a massive oversimplification, of course, but we will go with it. A synapse is a link between neurons, enabling them to pass signals, and a bunch of these signals propagating together in some fashion is what forms our thoughts. Now, each of these 86 billion neurons, all of them can have synaptic connections anywhere from hundreds to thousands of other neurons. This includes the neighboring neurons as well as the neurons from further regions of the brain. The usual estimate given for the number of synaptic connections in our brain, that is about 150 trillion. That's a lot of connections. This is the number of seconds in 100 years. The vast number of interconnections between the neurons of the brain through these synapses gives the brain its immense computational power and the seemingly limitless capacity of the long term memory. The main idea behind memory and learning is that these connections are plastic. That is, they are not fixed, they are constantly changing throughout the course of our life. These changes involve forming new connections via a process known as synaptogenesis or strengthening existing connections via a process called long term potentiation or LTP for short. Of course, the opposite is also true. The weakening and the pruning of unused synapses trims unimportant connections, leaving only the salient connections strengthened by the LTP. In 1949, Donald Hebb described an important process for learning. This process is known as the Hebbian learning and is usually summed up by the phrase neurons that fire together wire together, which basically means when two or more neurons fire or respond at about the same time, the connection or the link or the synapse between these neurons is strengthened. Whenever you are learning something, neurons are linking and strengthening. When these sets of neurons begin to work together more often, the connections between them become more robust. Links solidify in the long term memory and form the basis of proficiency. And with more practice, especially in novel ways, can extend this learning to new areas, which allow the neurons to tie in with other groups of neurons that underpin the related concepts. However, it's not that straightforward and easy to just form connections in the long term memory. In fact, I lied a little. When you're trying to memorize a speech or a script or a bunch of formulas for the first time, you may not quite be forming links in the long term memory, but rather placing them in a different place altogether. A temporary place, your working memory. Your long term memory is kind of what it sounds like. It holds the information for the long term. Information stored in the long term memory can be brought back to mind from weeks, months, or even years before. You can think of long term memory as the set of neural links that you have developed when you have learned something well. You have virtually unlimited storage capacity in your long term memory. On the other hand, your working memory is for temporarily holding patterns of thought. Rather than sets of neural links that reside happily, working memory is akin to a temporary slanted storage shelf. Firstly, it can't hold much. The capacity of your working memory is very little compared to long term memory. And secondly, since the shelf is slanted, as soon as you let go, everything falls off and your working memory is cleared. Working memory isn't really storing information in the sense that store now for later use. It is rather holding information. It is like a constant juggling of information from the front to the back of your brain and then back. And that is the key idea. As long as you're holding this information, the information is being constantly juggled in the brain. Information in your working memory is kept alive by bouncing it around certain regions of the brain. This roundabout movement might also be the reason why you can hold only so little in your working memory and why you might constantly be reciting the OTP or the number that you just learned. Since you only have to hold that information temporarily before, say, typing in the number and saving it in your phone, your working memory is at play there. It's working there. However, for the links to get formed in long term memory, that is, for learning to happen, working memory is incredibly important. To get the information into long term memory, there are primarily two pathways. That is the declarative pathway, this one uses the working memory, and the procedural pathway, which is very mysterious and interesting. We may refer to the information learned through the declarative system as the declarative memory, and that from the procedural pathway as the procedural memory. Declarative memory involves the information that can be consciously recalled, like facts or birth dates or events, formulas, and so on. Procedural memory, on the other hand, often involves the information that cannot be recalled consciously. That may not be the case for every instance, but for most skills that are learned through the procedural, it's hard to consciously recall them. It often involves the information that relates to how to do something, like the skill or the action, such as typing or riding a bike or tying a shoelace. Let's go into how these work one by one. Starting with the declarative system, it involves the hippocampus, your working memory, and the neocortex. The hippocampus or the hippocampal formation includes several regions in the middle part of your brain. But to simplify, we'll just lump all of them in one term: hippocampus. Your neocortex is a few millimeters thick. It is heavily dense of neurons. It is larger than the hippocampus. It is spread out across most of the brain and is where the large repository of long term memory is stored. In declarative learning, the working memory deposits the information that it is gathering into the long term memory in the neocortex. But the neocortex is huge. How can working memory ever find a specific piece of information again? The solution is an index. The hippocampus, it is sort of an index. It doesn't store the information in itself. It only links to where the information is stored in the neocortex. Signals from hippocampus can retrieve and link together the information in the neocortex. And each time you retrieve the information, the hippocampus strengthens these links between informations around the neocortex. Eventually, these links or these memories are consolidated in the cortex. And once consolidated, the working memory can reach into the neocortex and retrieve this information without the help of hippocampus. And that is a clue that something is well learned. The hippocampus is no longer needed in order to retrieve it. The better a student knows the material, the more her working memory can reach into the neocortex to retrieve the information without the need of hippocampus. Initially, though, the newly deposited information in the neocortex is represented by weak links. It is not even referred to as memory. It is called memory traces. This new learning is viable. Its meaning is not fully formed, and therefore it is easily altered. In the process of consolidation, these memory traces are reorganized and stabilized, giving them meaning, filling blank spots, and making connections to past experiences and other knowledge areas already stored in the long term memory. Consolidation may occur over several hours, days, weeks, or even longer. It involves deep processing of the new information, during which scientists believe that the brain rehearses, replays the learning. Prior knowledge is a prerequisite for making sense of the new learning, and forming those connections is an important task of consolidation. Sleep seems to play a huge role in memory consolidation, but in any case, consolidation or the transfer of learning to the long term memory happens over a period of time. So that means consolidation can occur during the many briefer moments interspersed between our learning and other activities. Indeed, even seconds long breaks during a learning experience have been shown to trigger memory related activity and predict later test performance. To understand consolidation a bit better, let's go through an analogy. Let's go through the experience of composing an essay. The first draft is rangy and imprecise. You discover what you want to say by writing to write it. After a couple of revisions, you have refined the piece and maybe strip away some of the unnecessary details. You put it aside, let it ferment, and when you pick it up again, say a day or two later, what you want to say has become more clear in your mind. Perhaps now you perceive that there are three main points you are making. You may even connect them to examples and supporting information familiar to your audience. You might even rearrange or draw together the elements of your argument to make it more effective and elegant. Similarly, the process of learning may start out as feeling unwieldy, disorganized, and the important aspects may not even be clear. Consolidation helps organize and solidify the learning, and notably, so does retrieval after a lapse of time. Because the act of retrieving a memory from long term storage can both strengthen the memory traces and at the same time make them modifiable again, enabling them to connect to a more recent learning. This process is called reconsolidation, and this is how retrieval practice modifies and strengthens learning. Remember how students will cram the night before the test to do all right on the test and then forget much of it afterwards? That happens because their working memory have created a lot of indexing in the hippocampus. These hippocampus indexing links are fresh enough to get the students through the exam, but the indexing links quickly fade away, and if the neocortex hasn't consolidated the information through, say, retrieval practice or other methods, forget about it. Let's just say it doesn't last very long. If the student wants to retrieve the information from the neocortex a month or two later, the hippocampus index is gone and there is just no ways to find the few faded links that might still remain in the long term memory. There is another problem with cramming as well, which is perhaps even worse. It turns out that the neurochemicals released during sleep serves as a sort of sealant for the newly formed links in the long term memory. A night of cramming with little to no sleep means whatever information might have slipped into the long term memory is not going to stick very long. We already talked about the declarative route of information to go into and out of the long term memory. Now, let's talk about the procedural path. This one is much more mysterious and much more interesting. For the most part, when you're conscious of what you're learning and what you are learning, you're probably using your declarative system. But the brain has a second way of getting information to the long term memory, a system we don't even have to think about consciously. This is the procedural learning system, of course, and it involves the basal ganglia, along with its associated structures, and the neocortex. With the procedural learning system, information is sifted and shifted from what we see, what we feel, what we do, into long term memory via the basal ganglia and associated structures. The procedural system is the basis for habitual actions. This kind of learning is very different from the learning in school. The basal ganglia receives input from the entire neocortex and projects it back to the neocortex, forming a giant loop. It takes about 100 milliseconds or so to go around that loop. This loop enables you to learn sequences of action and thoughts that you deposit as sets of neural links in your long term memory. These links turn into brain states and actions related to, say, thinking, language, song, dance. For example, if you reach out to touch a hot stove, the feedback is, that hurts. So you learn not to touch a hot stove. Working memory doesn't create procedural sets of links in the long term memory, but it can grab them once they are created. Once working memory grabs these links, you can become consciously aware of them. Well, at least some aspects of them. Like you can consciously turn right on your bicycle, but you're not thinking of the tiny muscle details. For the most part, you don't actually get conscious of how the procedural system comes to its conclusions, especially in the cases of behaviors learned through a myriad of experiences throughout your life. It is kind of a black box, if you will, inside of which we don't really know what goes on. Becoming more consciously aware through your working memory seems to move you toward the declarative system. Perhaps this is why, when you become consciously aware of the motion of your shoot, say in basketball, or the aim of your arrow, it can easily throw off your aim. Be one with the arrow may simply be a call to stay with the procedural rather than the declarative system, so your thoughts can flow swiftly and more smoothly. It is similar with speeches. For a well prepared speech, you probably don't even have to think about what you're saying for a well prepared one. But if something distracted you and pulled you out of your trance, you will be thrown off and you will witness the effects of going from procedural to the declarative system, where words flowed mindlessly and seamlessly through the procedural system. Through the declarative system, you might be stumbling and trying to figure out where you were and how to pick it back up again. An advantage for experienced teachers, however, is that they can become so versed with what they are teaching that their mouths are going on automatic, procedural mode, while their declarative working memory races ahead to read students' faces and anticipate questions. As you get more experienced with doing something procedurally, it seems to become easier to use your working memory for one thing while doing something else procedurally. This indeed is why a novice knitter is focused declaratively on learning to handle the yarn, while an expert knitter can chat happily while knitting. The procedural system is so far under the radar that it doesn't even seem to use the working memory or the hippocampus. Instead, procedural learning occurs gradually, day by day, mainly within the networks of neurons in the loop between the neocortex and the basal ganglia. Learning through procedural system means practice, plenty of practice, and practice takes time. That's why procedural learning is slower than declarative learning. However, once something has been learned procedurally, it can be processed and performed at a much more rapid rate in comparison to the knowledge acquired by the declarative system. Each learning system has types of information that it's particularly good at acquiring. You wouldn't really learn to ride a bike if you only relied on listening to instructions and taking notes. You would have to practice and learn using your procedural system. But both the learning systems can, and often do, learn information related to the same topic. The bottom line is this: unless there is a challenge with a particular pathway, you can use both the declarative and the procedural system to acquire information. Information learned declaratively is flexible but relatively slower to come to mind than the procedural system. Information learned procedurally can flow into the use with almost uncanny swiftness, but be inflexible. Think of how tough it would be to relearn how to type on a keyboard with a different configuration. On a side note, unlearning of knowledge built from the procedural system say from personal observation and common knowledge, is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of learning in many fields, including physics, psychology, law, and business. The common approach recommended for unlearning is plenty of practice with the new idea, and practice, of course, is the foundation of procedural learning. While learning, one system de emphasizes the other. That is to say, when one system is being used to learn, the other system is on standby. Once each system learns the information, this knowledge becomes complementary. Each way of knowing enhances your overall understanding and ability to work with the material. Ultimately, the information learned with both the systems forms the most powerful and deeper learning. It's easier to understand the declarative system because we are aware of it, or at least in part, but since we are mostly not conscious of the procedural system, we sometimes can miss out on utilizing this powerful system to learn better. The procedural system is not only involved in motor actions like shooting a basketball, driving a car, formation of habits like waving back at someone who waves at you. In addition to such routine, simple tasks, the procedural system can be critically important in learning staggeringly complex ideas and activities. Everything from grasping complex mathematical patterns to being able to speak an entire language quickly and naturally. The procedural system watches and learns from what you are doing, what you are seeing, what you are hearing, in order to assimilate and internalize the patterns, like the shapes of letter formations when you are young, or the inherent mathematical patterns you unconsciously access when you are trying to learn how to solve a Rubik's Cube. Since the information that you have learned does not necessarily go through the working memory, you can solve the cube more quickly. But it also means that even though you know how to solve the cube, you can't quite easily explain it as to how you are doing it so fast. To reiterate, working memory can grab well established sets of links that have been created by either the declarative or the procedural system. The declarative system, with its speedy way of learning, is often the first system to acquire the information. The procedural system follows slowly behind, learning the material, but learning very differently through practice. The magic of the procedural system is not how quickly it learns, but how quickly it can put that information to use once it's been well learned. With practice, you use fewer of the neural links that were deposited by the declarative system and instead use more of the neural links that were stored by the procedural system in the neocortex. But this switch to the procedural system does not necessarily delete the information that still rests in the long term memory, learned via the declarative system. When students learn through the procedure and the declarative system alternately, the information is being nestled into two places in the neocortex, two different places. Well, not really places because the information is being stored in forms of neural links and synaptic connections, but okay, you get the point. It's a little like having two legs. If you just have one leg, you can probably stand. But with two legs, not only are you more stable when you stand, but it is also easier to move forward. The procedural system basically has two doors, a front door for goal directed activities and a back door for habitual actions. We are more interested in the procedural goal directed system because this is where the declarative and the procedural system can work together. Your history of mistakes and successes in whatever you're learning shape your reflexes. You are perfectly conscious of your mistakes, but not of how the procedural system learns from those mistakes. One thing to note about memories is that they tend to semanticize over time. That is, the original context of the memory is erased and only the meaning is left. So you might know that you own a white t shirt, semantic knowledge, but you might not necessarily remember the surrounding context of how you got it. So that was about the two pathways for how learning can happen in our brains. But what can we do to learn more effectively? The first strategy that I would like to discuss is called spacing. The main idea is basically that effective study is not about cramming everything into a single session, but rather spreading out your study time strategically. It is deceptively simple but incredibly effective. But how long should the intervals be? Long enough so that at least some information has been lost from your working memory. This prompts your brain to work harder during retrieval, strengthening your long term memory. True learning requires building strong, lasting neural links in your long term memory, and it's not a one and done process like cramming. The second technique that I would like to mention is interleaving. Interleaving is all about mixing it up. Instead of sticking to one type of problem, You tackle a variety of problem types of a particular topic in a single study session. When you interleave, something very important and very interesting happens. Instead of just learning the method to solve a specific problem, you have to constantly decide which method to apply. That is the beauty of interleaving. It forces you to choose the right strategy for each problem. Let's say you're studying geometry. Instead of practicing calculating the area of triangles over and over, interleaving throws in problems about squares, rectangles, and even complex shapes. Each time you switch, your brain has to analyze the problem and to choose the right approach. See, learning, it's not a spectator sport. It's not enough to passively absorb information. True learning comes from actively engaging with it. Think of your brain like a giant interconnected roadmap. To really know a place, it's not enough to just memorize the street names. You need to explore the side streets, find shortcuts, and understand how different neighborhoods connect. And that is exactly what elaboration and reflection do for your learning. Elaboration means building those extra connections in your mental map. It is the art of enriching your understanding by connecting new information to what you already know. Take a new concept and ask yourself, how does this fit with what I already know? Can I explain it in my own words? What could be some real life examples of this concept in action? The more you link new information to your existing knowledge, the deeper and more lasting your understanding becomes. But how do we ensure that our elaboration goes beyond the surface level understanding? That is where reflection comes in. Reflection is the process of actively reviewing and analyzing our learning experiences. Say, after a class or a study session or even a real world experience, pause and ask, what were the key takeaways? What worked well and what didn't? What could I have done differently? How can I improve the next time? This kind of analysis is like a mental replay, and this helps your brain solidify what it's learned. It isn't just about recalling facts, it's about engaging with the knowledge on a deeper level. It might sound simple, but do not underestimate the power of connecting the dots. Here's the thing, testing of memorized information improves the memory of the tested information. Testing, with or without stakes, is a form of retrieval practice, and it is the act of retrieving information from the long term memory which strengthens the links in the long term memory associated with the retrieved information. It's kind of hard to overstate how crucial retrieval practice is for effective learning. It tells you what you know and you don't know, and second, just simply recalling the information from your long term memory causes the reconsolidation of the learning being recalled. In effect, retrieval interrupts forgetting. Retrieval practice is much better than repeated re exposure to the material, which just puts you in an illusion of learning. It increases your familiarity with the material and not necessarily strengthens the links in the long term memory. And it is very easy to confuse familiarity as a good indication of learning while it is not. If you are just simply mindlessly repeating something over and over without breaks, then you are leaning on your working memory and very little mental effort is required. You feel familiar with the text and you test your knowledge immediately and show gratifying improvement rather quickly. But in reality, the underlying representation of the skill that you're trying to learn hasn't strengthened much at all. Your performance in the moment is not an indication of durable learning. On the other hand, if you let your working memory to go empty for a while, or be occupied with some other information by utilizing spacing or interleaving, for example, and then try to retrieve what you learned from memory, you will be leaning on the memory traces formed in the long term memory. And it won't be perfect the first few tries, and it will take effort, but this simple act of retrieving information from the long term memory will strengthen the links in the long term memory, ultimately making it easier for you to recall in the future. So that was what is learning, how do we do it, and some strategies to do it better. Now, a lot of stuff that I talked about in this video have been drawn from two books mainly. One is this one, it's called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, and the other one you can see on your screen right now here, somewhere. And I highly recommend to anyone who is interested in the phenomenon of learning to read into these books because they are very good reads and filled to the brim with rich information and value. Make It Stick is just marvelously well written and everything is explained beautifully. I highly recommend it. However, If you're a teacher, and regardless if you're just starting out or have been teaching for years, I highly recommend this Uncommon Sense of Teaching book as it offers direct examples and advices on how the empirical finds of successful learning can be implemented in the classroom setting and even in the online teaching as well. I have provided the Amazon links to both of these books in the description below. They are affiliate links, by the way, so if you do buy them through those links, you will be supporting the channel. Thank you for that. And yeah, hopefully you learned something from this video on learning, and I wish you all the best in your learning endeavors.